Now, quick hack. The best way to navigate anything, because we're about to go into the list, with too much information is to establish category structure and logic that binds it all together. Okay, man, what do you mean? The best way to understand something that has too many details and they're just everywhere is to find the connections and the relationships between them. Now, I'll give you the example very quickly so that you see what I mean. So look at this. I picked the top 12, the most common. Gross domestic product, gross domestic product growth rates, GDP per capita, population growth, unemployment rate, current account to GDP, inflation, government budget, consumer confidence index, interest rates, industrial production growth, balance of trade, and so on and so forth. Now, GDP alone, there are 3 or 4 methods or 3 or 4 types of GDP indicators. There's GDP, PPP, price. Now, I don't want to start. My job is not to confuse you, and I want to stick to the script. The script is context. So if I've showed you 12, which you can go on AI, go online, research, and on your own determine what they are, and their definitions are there, and then further research what they mean, you are fine. So, and this is important for those of you who do a lot of teaching, and this is my recommendation. When you teach, you should not try to force information into people's throats, like somebody would have been tempted to do by defining everything here. There's no point. They can read it up. But what you want to do is, how does this all make sense? And that's what I'm about to show you. So follow my standard analogy. Organizing the ideas, and you're going to get used to this because I'll do this very often. So typically, if you look at an office, this is what you have in an office: desks, Adobe software, scanners, Flash, and software. Adobe was popular at the time this presentation was created in 2011, this particular slide. So look at this, what you can see here, and look at this. Now, I want to give you 30 seconds to appreciate this. Some of you already get it. This is what you call verbal reasoning or quantitative reasoning or logic. Inanimate things, furniture, computer, hardware, software. And you can see all the things on the furniture. You can see all the things on the computer hardware and all the things on the software. All right? Great. Now, once you identify the logic or structure, go ahead and make your infinite list. So in other words, when you see this, the problem with this is the way it's arranged, right? It's everywhere. So what's the Asian population, inflation, like it's too much to track. And that's where people switch off. But once you are able to identify everything and put it where they belong, like this, then it becomes clearer. Now, here is the issue. Most of the experts, right, do not usually take the time to put things for us like this on any subject. And that's where people always miss it. And that's what affected us when we're learning mathematics in school. We usually were only told, we were presented with the information like this. So the teacher comes, he gives us one example. The next thing, he gives us a test, classwork, and then he stops there. Guess what? Exam shows up and he gives you something. And like, they didn't give us. But I don't know whether that happened to you guys. They didn't teach us. Some people will pass. Oh, how did you know? Apparently, they went and researched outside the scope of what the teacher taught and found that extra example. Meanwhile, all the teacher needed to tell us is that, hey, quadratic equations, there are only 3 categories: furniture, computer, hardware. So in other words, if you know all the examples on that furniture, you are fine. If you know, but he will tell us only furniture and hardware and not tell us there's something called. So when you're able to show any complicated thing to look like this, government, economics, social, people will get it. Structure. So now here is the point. I did not find any suitable categorization as at the time of my research. There were things like lagging indicators, leading indicators. The context is different. So what I decided to do was, I said, you know what, I will put them under 3 categories. There is stuff related to economics, there is stuff related to government finance, and there's stuff related to what I call subjective priorities. Emmanuel, how did you come up with this? Now, one of the things you learn in crypto when we teach critical thinking is we try to explain that once you have the ability to think, you can define the logic yourself. And I gave you guys a hack today. I told you that every knowledge and understanding we have in the world today was created by humans. And if it was humans like you and I, the only reason why they have authority to tell you that you should believe what they're saying is because they were able to establish the logic, either using research or with theories that they've proven over time. So when Michael Porter tells you the 5 forces, he's telling you his own theory, even though he has data to back it up, to explain after observing. So if you look at a certain situation in your office, you can create your own theory if you can establish the logic. So Emmanuel, what was your logic? How did you arrive at these 3 headers? I arrived at these 3 headers because economic is economic. It's something that is not within the control of government. The second one is government. Government is the biggest economic determinant, political or bureaucratic, meaning civil service. So if government is, so I needed to give government its own category through the central bank, through its fiscal policy, how it spends its money, how it collects taxes. Then the third one is what I call subjective priorities. Subjective priorities, I had to come up with that to say, this may not exactly be government or economic, or they could be either, but it has to do with items that are important to that entity at that time. So in the US, for instance, consumer confidence is a big deal. Retail spending is very important information. We're in December now. They're going to be tracking their retail spending. Why is their retail spending important? Their retail spending is important because they are large economies. Now, this is my opinion. Please follow me. You're going to see some interesting logic. Their economies are retail spending is a trigger across various chains. When consumers spend, more things need to be produced to replenish. So companies go back to production. Logistics is there. Banks benefit. Government, more revenue from profits, and so on and so forth. So it's as long as people are spending, that spending sends these activities into motion, and it builds economic activity, right? Also, for countries like UK, they have a very huge tourists coming to the country, and those tourists need to come in and shop, and that shopping, does help their economy. To those businesses, those local businesses. So as businesses are doing well, people are buying coffee, people are hanging out, people are eating at fast foods, and it just is a beehive of activity. Just remember your university campus and the environment around it. The economic activity that was created there is what happens when retail is booming. But when retail slows down, it's a terrible thing. It's borderline, recession, as it were, or even depression. It's always a bad sign. So that's how I categorized it. Now, if you become very good at this after learning from here, and you go and create your own classification that you can justify, feel free. All right. So here's the list right under it. We have, and I'm going to just bring it all at once. Like I said, so for economy, we have GDP, inflation, unemployment, stock market, balance of trade. These are all things around economic. Even the stock market, someone who sits, it can't sit on a government, but it's usually a subjective priority, in my opinion. Then we have government revenue, government spending, current account to GDP, interest rates, government debt. Nigeria's debt is over 80 trillion naira. Over 80 trillion naira. Put that in perspective, all right? Then we have subjective. Subjective, there are things like stock market, consumer spending, industrial growth, private debt to GDP, consumer confidence, blah, blah, blah. The list is endless. What I'm teaching you here is the logic, all right? Follow me. Now, globally, now we've started to settle down. There are 2 indicators that I want you to leave this room with. At least start from here. Thing about knowledge is don't shove it off your throat in 45 minutes. I'm not going to do that. So I want to teach you how to navigate your way. And let me give you 2. Economic growth and inflation. Now, this is the one I believe a lot of you will learn today. Economic growth reflects the growth in the quality and quantity of goods and services produced in a country. What does that mean? All of us on this call all work for a living. If I were to calculate the GDP of all of us on this call, 29 of us, it's okay, everybody's salaries add it up. And it adds up to, let's say, 25 million. So I would say, now this is not the perfect example, but it's to help you appreciate the GDP of the people on this phone call is 25 million naira. Well, it'd be more probably. Let's say 45 million naira. All right? That's an example of when we say economic growth. So GDP, gross domestic product, all the goods and services that are produced in a country. All right? So, and of course, the different methods and the subcategories, and you'll read all that when the time comes. Now, I just want to explain how to do with economic activity. Now, Nigeria is projected to grow at just about 3%, depending on whose report you believe. IMF says about 3.1, they're about 3.2. And I think the president said about 3.7 in his budget presentation, or thereabout. But it doesn't really matter, they're all within the 3% range. So, GDP growth is the growth in the number of goods and services, or the volume of goods and services, the value of goods and services, the value of goods and services that are produced in a year. So if this year the value was 500 billion, and then we grew by 3%, it indicates growth. And you'll see the reason shortly and why it's important. So it's growth in the production of goods and services, the value of goods and services. Inflation, on the other part, tracks changes in prices of goods and services. Golden one was 1.5, now it's 1.7 or 2K, 2.5 prices. Of course, that's just food, but across different products, and there are of course different indicators and different categories of inflation to inflation rates to measure, right? But the key thing is that for a developing country like us, between 7 and 11% is the healthy zone. Anything above it begins to slow down rates, slow down growth, and I'll show you the relationship. So it affects us. You'll be like, okay, what do you mean? But our inflation is over 20%. Yes, Nigeria's inflation hit 27%. Meanwhile, the safe zone is 7 and 11. Developed countries, they're talking below 7. Now, when the world Ukraine war started, it has hit double digits. Some of them were in the 10, 12, 14, 15, 16 range. And that made them increase interest rates. Now you remember? So there is too much money in circulation, right? Because inflation is a reflection of the rising prices. So if prices go up, too much money has to be pushed in to follow those prices. So you remember your last supermarket experience. Everything has driven up, has gone up. So you have more money in circulation. So you know what they do? They increase interest rates to reduce the money in circulation. Say, how does that work? Well, the way it works is when they increase interest rates, borrowing increases. There is also yields on investments that makes people, say, okay, no problem. Instead of giving money to consumers, let's put the money, let's go and buy government bonds, or let's conserve money. But the bigger part is that it makes borrowing expensive. So companies reduce, so companies that borrow will not borrow. Banks, so everybody, no, I can't borrow. The rate is too high, blah, blah, blah. So that withdrawal of cash from the system it also now creates another bad effect, which is that, okay, people are not borrowing, people are not investing. So you see there's a cyclical effect that I'll talk about shortly, which likes of Milton Friedman, where, had discussed, which you should shortly. So once again, because this is where it begins to get a little complicated, and that's where people lose and switch off. Economic growth, now you remember GDP growth. It is the growth in the value of goods and services produced in a country. Productivity. Inflation, on the other part, is the prices, right, of goods and services, and the changes in prices. And Nigeria's case was so bad, and everybody felt it, even though it was triggered by the recovery from COVID that we're already trying to recover from, Russia and Ukraine disruption of value chain, of the value chain, global supply value chain, and then we now remove subsidy. And when you thought that was just enough, you saw what happened to our naira and all the dependency that we have on importation of goods and services. So you're beginning to see how that was triggered, and how that triggered the rising cost of goods and services.